Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Hope everyone had a good holiday and some time off. I've not been on a Zoom meeting since Tuesday. I hardly know how to live in these days of pandemic shutdown. So, welcome back to our virtual zendo and to our communal practice. So today we're taking up Gate 49 of the 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination. And our gate statement for today says, equality of all elements is a gate of Dharma illumination, for it obviates all rules for harmonious association. So today, clearly, we're continuing to look at aspects of equality, or Byodo. We've brought this up in previous gates. The kanji here says great equality, literally says great equality, which makes me think of equality in the largest possible sense, right? So we're going beyond looking at equality of individual things to the greatest possible perspective on equality. So this equality in the largest possible sense makes me think, well, if we don't create separation, if we give up discriminative thinking, then we can also give up the guidelines and the rules and the laws that we have in place to make it possible to live together. And that doesn't quite seem to make sense, right? That seems like a kind of a wacky pairing. If we don't distinguish between a green light and a red light, and we also throw out all the traffic laws, don't we have chaos? And the answer is yes, we do. So, how do we hold both of those things? How do we work with both of these things? So I'm going to suggest that this gate is pointing us toward good and bad, and going beyond good and bad, and what that means for living by precepts. So this is a real problem for us, because when we misunderstand this teaching about the equality of all elements and going beyond good and bad, then we can decide that ethics or morality are not important, right? There's no good and bad, so I can do whatever I want. I can sort of throw out all the teachings about ethical conduct and all of that stuff, because in the big world, there's no good and bad. We can also decide that people who keep precepts are good people, and people who don't keep precepts are bad people, either because they break the precepts or because that's just not their practice. So we can really fall into some discriminative pitfalls around these things. It can be a way to really justify some kinds of discrimination. Um, that discrimination within our tradition might be discrimination against, for instance, fishermen or leather workers, or people who kill as part of their jobs. This is, clearly an important precept. We can develop discriminative practices or thinking about people with disabilities, people in difficult life situations, because we can decide, well, this is just their bad karma. They brought this on themselves. Therefore, they don't need my compassion. Therefore, their suffering isn't my problem. So as bodhisattvas, this is an issue, right? As bodhisattvas, we vow to liberate all beings from suffering. We vow to have compassion for everybody. And yet, it's easy to fall into these kind of pitfalls when we start working with ideas of good and bad and teachings about good and bad. So because of wisdom and compassion, the meaning of precepts changes moment by moment by moment. So yes, we have a written list of something we call the 10 grave precepts. Yeah, we can write those things down, and yet we can't grab them in that form and say, this is a fixed rule, this is true forever and ever, amen. Because of our own wisdom and our own compassion, these precepts are changing all the time. There's nothing we can really grasp. So that makes it difficult to know what is good. What is bad? What do those things mean? There is no fixed code of behavior based on precepts. So, how do we know what to do? This is tough for us, right? When we decide we're going to take lay precepts, or when we decide we're going to ordain and take precepts again, we get to think about this. What does this mean? Even if we're not formally taking precepts, just the fact that we're practicing raises these questions, especially in challenging times. What is good? What is bad? How do we work with that? What does that mean? So one reason, of course, that we can't pin down what is good, what is bad, is impermanence. This is one of the basic characteristics of being in the world. We hear a lot about impermanence. Things are changing all the time. Something that's useful right now might not be useful later on, including guidelines and rules and precepts. Even the way we describe our relationship to things. changes. Hojo-san is always using his example about he holds up a marker, and he says, today, this is a marker. It's useful for me. I'm giving a talk. I'm writing notes. This is a marker. When the marker dries up or runs out of ink, this becomes trash, right? So my relationship with this thing is changing all the time. Golly, in a world where everything is changing, how do we take a stand, right? How do we know what's good and bad? So Sawaki Roshi had a lot to say about good and bad and going beyond good and bad. So we're going to be hearing from him quite a bit this morning. He's got some useful things to say. So one of the things he says is what adults teach children is often nothing more than outdated views. The view that good is good and bad is bad has already had its best days. Even a vegetable, which was once good is inedible once it's past its prime. We've got to always be able to see things from a fresh perspective, right? So here's a vegetable which is delicious today. In a few days, it's not so good. Our relationship with these things is changing all the time. This vegetable that was good is not good anymore. So Sawaki Roshi is reminding us, views can be like this too, right? A view which is helpful today changes 5 minutes from now, or changes in a month or next year. We get a new piece of information, or we see something differently. So clinging to views, even views about good and bad and right and wrong and laws and guidelines, is a problem, even though we would like to think we're living good moral lives, based on some kind of framework. So defining a fixed code of behavior is not what these precepts are about, right? When we start to learn about precepts, we pretty quickly see this is not a rule book. This is not a go-to that says, in the case of A, we do B. It just doesn't work that way. We can think of precepts as guidelines for carrying out bodhisattva vows, but they also simply describe what life is like when we are living from a place of awakening, right? When we're living with big mind or pure mind or whatever we want to call that, but we can't describe. Precepts are a description of what life is like there. When we see the equality of all elements, something interesting arises. So that means really knowing whether differences between elements are true and whether they're important. Are there really distinctions to be made, and are those distinctions important? And if they're important, like why, right? So seeing the entirety of the network of interdependent origination isn't really enough. We also have to see the individual nodes in the network. We've got to see that the broadest possible perspective, right? There are individuals with characteristics, whether that's people or elements or things we encounter. And also there's the broad view that says there is no separation, right? There is only the network, and all of these things are interconnected. So we have oneness and diversity, right? We have difference and sameness. This is familiar territory for us. This sort of duality and going beyond duality is familiar territory. In fact, Uchiyama Roshi said, all of the words in the Shobo Genzo should be read as pointing to non-duality. So here we are, another way to work with these teachings. So, we have to see the entire picture, and we have to see the differences, and we have to see which differences matter in this moment. What am I going to do in this particular moment? So, the difference between French fries and carrot sticks is important if we're cooking a meal and serving a meal. The difference between, long carrot sticks and short carrot sticks is not so different, or not so important, right? So we get to see the whole picture. So in our daily lives, we can't entirely go beyond good and bad. We can't entirely go beyond discriminative thinking. We need to distinguish the green light from the red one. We need to distinguish the food that's still good from the food that's gone bad. We can't work only with this broad, very broad, absolute equality of all elements kind of view. We need both of these things. We have to make distinctions. We have to make choices. So when we hear teachings about going beyond good and bad, that doesn't negate differences, right? The emptiness doesn't negate the form. The forms are still there. We still have to work with them. We just have to see sort of something larger than that. So within our relationships with others, within the world in general, we have to decide what's valuable, what's meaningful, what's wholesome for ourselves and other beings, and what isn't. And then what are we going to do about that? So there needs to be some kind of rules or guidelines for how to live together in a healthy, wholesome way in order to reduce suffering, in order to have peace and harmony, because, we're baby bodhisattvas, as Hojo-san freak picture. We don't yet have that basis on which to make every choice and make every decision. So some kind of guidelines and some kind of rules are helpful. And yet, we need to know those aren't fixed. Those are man-made. We can't cling to them. So if we see only this one unified reality, we think that we need to live only in a world beyond discrimination or choosing or distinction, then that's a problem, right? We can decide that going beyond good and bad means we can do whatever we want, and the outcomes don't matter, and the effects on other people aren't important, because in the big reality, everything's perfect, everything's fine. So going good and bad can become an excuse for unwholesome behavior or unskillful behavior. Historically, this has been a problem in some Western Dharma centers. I'm guessing not only in the West, but the ones I know about. Historically, this is a problem in Dharma centers because teachers have made mistakes. Sometimes they've made pretty bad mistakes. And, because they and their students thought, oh, well, they are somehow beyond morality, they are somehow beyond good and bad. Oh, all of this is skillful means. Those mistakes get perpetuated, or they get covered up, or somehow they don't get dealt with. And sanghas will blow up based on that stuff, right? So we have to be really careful about good and bad and going beyond good and bad, right? So yes, there's a big absolute view. It doesn't mean there isn't wholesome and unwholesome behavior. So not seeing individuals and seeing only the broad view can make it easy to ignore suffering, which is really the opposite of what we're vowing to do as bodhisattvas, right? So as bodhisattvas, we can't ignore distinction. We can't live only in the world of equality of all elements in the highest possible way. So when I was thinking about this talk, interestingly, I heard on the radio somebody talking about an opera called Silent Night. Probably somebody's going to stage this thing pretty soon, given the time of year that it is. And the story of this opera is that in World War I, the enemy combatants kind of meet, right? During a ceasefire, and they get to know each other a little bit, and that's a kind of a famous story, right? Somebody's turned this into an opera. So the German, the French, the English, and the Scottish troops all talk, and they come to understand each other a little bit. There's a story around that. So the composer says of this opera says, once your sworn enemy ceases to be faceless, war becomes less possible. Isn't that interesting? Right? If we don't see the distinctions, we can make some pretty bad mistakes. We can do something pretty unwholesome. And yet once we get to know, who are the people in the opposition, oh, wait a minute, these folks are human beings. Oh, wait a minute, there's some common ground, right? All beings have suffering. It doesn't look the same, but there's some commonality there. Once the enemy has a face, it's harder, right, to inflict injury. It's harder to make war on another group when we see that, well, wait a minute, these are individuals with families and lives, and they're not unlike me in that way. So war is a big impersonal kind of complicated set of circumstances. We can get really caught up in in the monetary cost of that, or the logistics of moving supplies around, or all of that kind of geography. But within those larger circumstances, there are individuals who get hurt or get killed or have their livelihoods taken away or their homes destroyed or something, right? So we can't ignore the particulars and see only the broadest possible view. And yet this gate says equality of all elements makes rules unnecessary. So, like, what's going on? These things don't seem to go together. So there's a famous verse in the Dhammapada, which I'm sure you've heard or come across, not doing of any evil, doing of all good deeds, purification of one's own mind. This is the teaching of all Buddhas. This is a really basic teaching that we hear a lot. So these threefold pure precepts, which is what this amounts to, in a slightly different form, are still part of our precept ceremony today, or part of our Ryakusatsu today. If you come to our monthly Ryakusatsu, you'll hear these things. I'm sorry for my focus here. Let's hope that clears up. So not doing evil and doing good are straightforward enough. That kind of makes sense. But what about this third line about purification of one's own mind? What does that mean? So it's talking about going beyond good and bad. Not clinging to evil, but also not clinging to good. Because any kind of clinging is defilement. So, we might give up the doing of the evil, the doing of the unwholesome, the clinging to the selfishness that drives all of that stuff. But it's also possible to cling to our good deeds, right? And not to let go of them. And either falling down on either side is defilement. So Dhammapada is one of the oldest Buddhist texts. We can see that this problem of good and evil has been, around for a long time. This problem of good and evil on the one hand, equality of all elements on the other. This has really been around since the beginning of our practice. Why? Because this is pretty fundamental to our human living. And it's still a conundrum today. We know. This is still something we're wrestling with today. Sawaki Roshi said, do good, leave the bad. There's no doubt about that. But is it so clear what good and bad is? Good and bad go hand in hand. So he's still wrestling with this, even today. I'm going to try to fix my focus. Give me just a moment here, because it bothers me. I'm sure it's bothering you. Let's do this. And let's do that. And we'll hope it redraws. We'll see. There we go. Very good. Okay, so yet we still have to be able to distinguish wholesome from unwholesome, even though we have this thing about equality of good and bad. So actions that bring about pain to ourselves, pain to other people, are generally considered to be unwholesome actions. Actions that bring about happiness or joy or pleasure to ourselves or to other beings are generally considered to be wholesome. And this is a key aspect of the principle of cause and effect. And cause and effect is really important to skillful action, right? Cause and effect is important within our tradition anyway. It's one of the key things about our tradition anyway, this belief that there's an effect of what we do. Clearly, it's the basis of ethics. It's the basis of Buddhist ethics. So we can see we've got lots of things kind of tied up here. So no matter what our faith tradition is, or if we have no faith tradition, we start to understand good and bad from a pretty young age, right? With toddlers, it's all about self-involvement, self-interest. I won't do this because mommy will punish me, or I will do this thing because daddy promised me a reward if I do it. If I clean my room, I get to go to the amusement park or something. So it's all about, what am I getting out of this? That's where the toddler is in the toddler's own development. When kids are a little older, then the ethical judgments start to get based on the amount of damage done and the intention. So it's worse to break 3 glasses than to break 1. It's also worse to break a glass when you're just playing around as opposed to you broke a glass because you were helping to wash the dishes, right? So older kids can start to make these distinctions. After that, there's some degree of social approval involved. I won't do this bad thing because I want people to like me. Or I won't do this bad thing because it's against the law. Older kids start to know that's against the law. So then there's some societal pressure around, our ideas about good and bad. By adolescence, with any luck, we understand that there are things we don't do simply because we're morally obligated not to do them, or I'm not going to do this because it's just wrong, right? With luck, we get to that point. But chances are, until we started to practice, nobody was telling us about going beyond good and bad. Right? So, as humans in society, we develop along certain lines. Probably until we got to the Buddha, nobody ever said, wait a minute, there's this thing called going beyond good and bad. So this is kind of a new way to think about this. So when we live in the world of good and bad, we transmigrate around these 6 realms of samsara, right? So based on whether or not we are doing things that perpetuate wholesomeness or perpetuate suffering, or things that liberate, other beings or contribute to delusion. But it's also about our clinging to ideas about what good and bad are, particularly what's good for this one, what's bad for this one. As long as we're clinging to all of that stuff and making all those judgments, we're going around and around on this wheel of samsara. When we go beyond good and bad and we can see equality of all elements, that's nirvana. So that's purification of one's own mind, as this piece from the Dhammapada says. It's also called awakening, or pure mind, or Buddha, or whatever word you like to give to this thing we can't describe. Right? So how do we go beyond good and bad? How do we let go of the yardstick without creating absolute chaos? Well, we just do good without clinging to good. We do the good action without clinging to the good action, or comparing our good deeds to what others are doing. My good deeds are better than yours, or yours are better than mine, or mine aren't quite as bad as yours, right? Somehow there's always this comparing and judging and labeling. So Sawaki Roshi says there is a bad deed called doing good. For some, doing good is just a decoration. So that's interesting. What's our motivation for doing good, right? Are we doing it actually, out of our bodhisattva vow, or are we doing it to hang a little decoration on ourselves? This is, I'm a good person. I did good, or I didn't do bad. So in other words, it's just a kind of another way to shore up the sense of small self or the sense of ego. Even though we think we have a good motivation, and probably we do. It's not that all of our good actions are entirely driven by self-involvement. It also doesn't mean that we shouldn't do that good action. Even if we notice there's this little bit of self-clinging in there. Yeah, there's a little voice that says, if I do this thing, people will love me, or I will be important, or I will get recognition somehow, or I will feel good about myself. Yeah, that's probably there. That doesn't mean we just don't do the good action. That doesn't negate, the good of the wholesome action. That clinging doesn't necessarily mean, well, full stop. We don't take any action at all, because there are very few human actions that aren't going to be colored somehow with that little bit of something that says, there's something in it for me, right? So, that includes avoiding doing bad simply to avoid the unpleasant consequences for ourselves. That's the toddler stage, but, we fall prey to it too, right? That's the kind of thinking that says, well, I would decide it's okay to steal your chocolate cake if I'm not going to get caught, right? If you'll never know it was me. I would do whatever bad I wanted to do if only there wasn't somebody standing there, with a stick ready to punish me, right? Not an entirely maturely developed view of ethics, right? So we can move beyond the toddler stage a little bit, because there's self-interest in there too, right? So, we got to notice where the self-interest is. So Sawaki Roshi again, however much good they do, everything that humans do is bad. If you give all day long, you think, I gave. If you do religious practice, you think, I practiced. If you do something good, you never forget, I did good. Does this mean that we should do something bad instead? No. Even when we do good, it's bad. When we do something bad, it's even worse. You gotta love Sawaki Roshi, right? If you do good, you start to work yourself up about everything bad you suddenly see in others. When you've done something bad, you're quiet because your own ass itches. People don't only calculate when it's a matter of money. In everything they do, they try to bargain up or down. That's because their body and mind haven't dropped off. Only when body and mind have dropped off does this business not count anymore. Dropping off body and mind means immeasurability or limitlessness. So he's pointing us toward this equality of all elements, right? We need to understand that this teaching about, doing good and not doing evil and all of that, there's a human perspective on that, right? There's some man-made rules that come out of that, and also there's something much larger going on. It's a manifestation of absolute reality that we actualize with this body and mind, right? So in these individual karmic circumstances, we actualize something which goes beyond the individual karmic circumstances. So body and mind dropped off means the perspective of these 5 skandhas doesn't get in the way, right? Doesn't come between, right? Doesn't create that kind of separation. So we see with eyes of Buddha is one way to put that, right? We see the equality of all elements. We also see the elements. So we get to see everything. We see reality as it is before we start poking our heads in and writing the stories and making the judgments and, sort of acting based on self. There's something, that's there before we start the thinking apparatus. And what is that about? So a minute ago, I said the same thing about the precepts. They're not just rules, they're descriptions of living from this place of awakening, right? So it's the same thing. It's the same kind of teaching. So this is another way to say that practice and awakening are not two, right? One of Dogen's key teachings for us. Practice and awakening are not two. Awakening isn't a thing. Awakening isn't a state, right? It's an activity. It's a functioning. There's something dynamic happening there. It's not a state we get to and then we stay there. It's not a state we get to when we can grasp. It's constantly changing because it's a function. It's a functioning. So, the activity of experiencing this moment from the point of view of Buddha before the small self jumps in and starts writing a story and putting up a thought covering, right? There's something before that. There's something beyond that. So small self is there. Individual karmic circumstances are there. They don't somehow disappear. We don't avoid them or negate them, but they're not the starting point for our experience. If we're living from that place of awakening, we're not starting with our personal sort of point of view. We're also not constrained by that point of view or limited by that point of view. There's something broader that we can touch, that we can be in touch with. So when we see the equality of all elements, as well as the individual characteristics of whatever we're encountering, then our actions become skillful. Our actions are appropriate, right, for that circumstance. They're beneficial without needing to be labeled good or bad, because that's simply our perspective. We want to name things. There is wholesomeness there that we don't have to call wholesomeness, right? We're not making some effort to decide, is this good or bad, with the intellect. We're simply responding to that moment because we're part of that moment. We're part of the true reality of all beings, and there's no separation there. So wholesomeness arises. Hojo-san says, when supreme awakening is expressed in words, what it says is, do not do any evil. And in fact, not doing evil is awakening itself. That's our practice of receiving and following the precepts, right? So there's this functioning happening here. Doing good and avoiding evil isn't something we do by ourselves, right? It's not something we do based on our intellect, based on our labeling of good and bad and our own sort of personal effort and all that stuff. It's not about, well, I'm going to do something in order to get a result. It's something that arises together with the functioning of all beings, because there's no separation in this network, right? All beings are functioning together. So it's just really the universe doing what the universe does. It's the complete practice of this moment. So, there's things we need to sort of consider about that. There's a real subtle difference between ignoring good and bad and going beyond good and bad. And I think when we encounter these teachings, we start to think, well, this means that I should just sort of not pay any attention to labeling good and bad, or deciding what I like and what I don't like. Somehow that's bad, and I need to push that away, or I need to suppress that or something. I don't think that's what we're talking about here. It's not simply using the intellect to convince ourselves, well, differences aren't important, because we fall into pitfalls around that, right? Consciously letting go of preferences or just sort of not acting on them is okay, but it's not enough. We have to keep going, right? We have to see the preferences. We have to not get entangled in the preferences, but we need to keep going. We need to keep seeing into that. We need to be in the place where we see those preferences arising, and yet we're not pulled around by them, because we also see something that's bigger. So we don't need to let go of our just sort of human day-to-day lives. It's okay to like, something and not like something else, but are we getting pulled around by it? And can we see beyond it? Do we know that that's simply our own sort of thought coverings in that moment? So, it's not a matter of being offered tea or coffee and saying, well, I don't care, when you really want the tea. Right? I mean, it's okay to prefer tea. Practitioners in Dharma centers are sometimes surprised to find that the teacher has preferences. Wait a minute. They're supposed to be equality of all things, and they're supposed to be, well, whatever comes down the pike is okay, and we're not supposed to have any kind of picking and choosing. And, somebody decides, wait a minute, the teacher has preferences. And then the people who know what those preferences are can feel like an in-group. Ooh, I've got some inside information. The teacher, the doctor said, this happened in a Dharma center I was in. Ooh, the doctor says the teacher really needs prune juice in the morning, but the teacher prefers orange juice. Oh, ha, ha, ha. Isn't that human? And it's like, wait a minute. Well, yeah, the teacher's human. Teacher's got preferences, right? So it's like, the people who kind of can see through that think, oh, we've seen the cracks in the teacher's practice or something. Wait a minute. No, that's not what this is talking about. It's okay for us to like things, It's okay for us to think, well, peas, not my favorite, right? It's not about ignoring that stuff. All that stuff is just a thought covering, really, on top of the reality of this moment. So it's fine to like cherry pie better than apple pie, as long as we don't create a lot of suffering about that. I'm going to steal yours because I like it better than mine, right? Or I'm going to label the person who made, this pie because I like this one better, right? I mean, we know how we kind of perpetuate this suffering. It's not about not being human. It's not about sort of being dead, right? I mean, that's our practice is about being alive and the freshness of this moment. So it's not about shutting ourselves down. And I think that's a pitfall that we can fall into when we start to think about this whole picking, choosing good and bad, right? So please live your life to its full extent. Experiencing is fine. When we can see the entirety of what's happening in this moment, when we can see, the most broad perspective, then we naturally realize there's really nothing we can grasp. There's really no ground to stand on. We don't get tangled up in that stuff, in our preferences. It's fine to have plans and values and priorities. It's fine to study and to commit to precepts. But when we look carefully at this moment, what's happening right now? right? In this moment, what's going on? What's happening? We realize we can't stand on the plans, the preferences, the goals, the whatever. There's nothing we can really grab onto. So, we don't get stuck. So Sawaki Roshi says, fortune and misfortune, good and bad, not everything is how it looks to your eyes. It's not how you think it is either. We've got to go beyond fortune and misfortune, good and bad. So we look at things, we think we understand it, we think we know, we think we're going to make a choice. He's saying, okay, and and what else, right? We need to constantly be asking what else. Yes, I like cherry pie better than apple, and what else? So where do we experience the equality of all elements? Where do we get to sort of be in touch with that practice and we can see the equality without ignoring the particulars? Well, of course, that's our zazen, right? Not a surprise. We let go of thinking. We don't act on the delusion that arises because of our karma as human beings. We have suffering, we have delusion. In zazen, we're not going to take action based on that. So we get to experience the world directly without the filters and the mediation of our conditioning and the things that sort of we've taught ourselves to think or believe. So again, this isn't something we need to learn. It's not something we need to acquire. We're not sitting in zazen contemplating the precepts so that we can decide what to do when we get up off the cushion, right? It's not about that. And again, Sawaki Roshi says, zazen is beyond good and evil. It's not moral education. Zazen takes place where communism and capitalism finish. I think that's really interesting, right? What are we doing in zazen but letting go of distinction? So where communism and capitalism finish, I think is a really interesting way to put that. And consider when he was writing, right? So in zazen, there are no opposites. There are no competing factions. There's no discrimination between inside and outside and good and bad. We're letting go of all of that. When we come to the end of that kind of separation, what's waiting at the end of that is pure mind or awakening or Buddha, if you want to think about it that way. Buddha's waiting for us out beyond the point where we, can let go of all of that stuff. So it's always there if we can just shift our focus from clinging to small self-interest, narrower point of view. So zazen sits in the intersection, I think, between good and bad, and also in the intersection between good and bad and going beyond good and bad. We're not even making a distinction between those two things, right? We're letting go of all those distinctions. So the threefold pure precepts I mentioned earlier, I think, also sit in this intersection. The version we use in our ceremonies is the precept of embracing moral codes, the precept of embracing beneficial actions, the precept of embracing all living beings. Those are the three pure precepts as we use them at Sanshin. So Hojo-san has explained that there was a late 17th century teacher called Menzan. We've talked about Menzan here before. And he thought that these three precepts were a way to use the three poisons for good. So we can transform the three poisons into something wholesome, right? So again, here it's sitting in this intersection. In other words, we can connect unwholesomeness to wholesomeness. These things are not polar opposites. Somehow they function together. Sawaki Roshi was saying, what's the distinction between good and bad? So here's a good example of that intersection and how they're not really separate. So embracing moral codes is the same as not doing evil, right? We can use anger. We can use aversion to harmful actions to keep from going down that path. I really don't want to create suffering in the world. I have some aversion to creating suffering in the world, so I'm not going to do unwholesome things that create more suffering in the world. It helps us not to do those things which injure people or create, some kind of unwholesomeness or suffering around us. Embracing beneficial actions is the same as doing good. So we can use greed to help us do as many good things as possible, right? There's always one more good action we can do. Or there's always one more little bit of self-interest maybe that we let go of, right? So we can be greedy in a positive way. I'm greedy for doing all the possible good actions, not based in my self-interest, that I can do. That's an interesting way to look at it, right? Dogen Zenji said in the Tenzo Kyokun, you must not fail to add a single speck to the top of the mountain of good deeds, right? So there's always one more little thing we can do. This is not about martyring ourselves, by the way, right? We've talked about this before. Martyrdom is just another ego trip. That's an idea about good and bad. Oh, I have to suffer for other people. Oh, I have to give up something which is good for me in order to do something for other people. That's an idea. That's not what this is talking about, right? We're going to do the most good we can do without clinging to self-interest. And the third one, embracing all living beings, is the same as going beyond good and bad, or seeing the equality of all elements, right? We can use ignorance to see beyond separation, to see beyond discrimination, and sort of help all beings equally, right? So if we're going to choose to sort of be ignorant of distinction, of separation, like, yeah, we see what's going on, but we can sort of take a step back and use ignorance in a kind of a positive way. Then we get to help all beings equally, not just the beings we like, or the beings we feel sorry for, or the beings we agree with, right? We get to really do what the Bodhisattva does, which is to have compassion for all beings and try to liberate all beings. So these 3 pure precepts give us another way also to look at the other 10 precepts, at the 10 grave precepts. So don't do evil can simply mean, don't break this precept. Don't engage in killing or stealing or some kind of misconduct that's described by this precept. Don't do this unwholesome thing. Do good. It's not enough just to passively not break the precept. We have to actively do good, right? So it's not enough just not to steal. We also have to be generous. It's not enough just not to kill. We also have to nurture life or nurture beings. We have to actively do some kind of good. We don't just not slander the 3 treasures. We take refuge in the 3 treasures. We take care of the 3 treasures, right? So it's not enough to just say, well, I'm not going to do something bad. We actively have to do good. And the third one, going beyond good and bad, is to see what's actually happening in this moment, what's actually needed in this moment, beyond what I think about it, or beyond my conditioned response. And sometimes, interestingly, that leads to breaking a precept. So if what this moment requires is that we break a precept, we do that when necessary, which is going beyond good and bad. So in other words, we don't cling to the precepts because nothing is fixed. Right? So we can't even cling to that. So there are certainly stories in this tradition, which I'm sure you've heard, about practitioners or monks or teachers appearing to break precepts for some kind of larger good, right? Somebody takes something from the temple, whether that's food or money or jewels or supplies or something, does something to give that to poor people who really, really need it, and then they accept the consequences of that. They get banished from the temple, or they get censured in some way for taking this action. And, we could argue for a long time about was that action justified or not. And there's still lots of discussion around those things. Why did so-and-so do that thing? And was that the right thing to do? And, people come down on either side of it. Was it a skillful means? Was there self-interest there? Was there a larger good being served? There's no easy answer to that. Sometimes going beyond good and bad means breaking a precept or breaking a rule or breaking the law. Maybe that's something we're more familiar with, people who are passively breaking laws because they believe they are engaging in compassionate action. So there's no easy answer to that. We can't cling even to laws or precepts because in this moment, there is nothing fixed. So the question we have to ask ourselves is not necessarily, what is the good thing to do? What is the bad thing to do in this situation? Instead, we can ask ourselves, what will keep the network of interdependent origination in the healthiest possible condition? Which is a different way to look at that, right? What if we set aside good and bad and just said, what is the healthy thing here, in this situation? And in the next moment, it's going to be something else. So we take action with the same mind, I think, that we have when we're in the middle of zazen, right? It's that same zazen mind. When we're sitting, we just sit, nothing extra. That's what shikantaza is. We're always hearing about how shikantaza is nothing extra. So when we're sitting, that nothing extra is we don't have a goal for our sitting. We don't have ideas about our sitting. We're not measuring our sitting. There's just sitting, right? When we're helping, we just help. And again, with nothing extra. So we're not getting involved with labeling, judging, comparing. We might not be involved with thinking about rules, or we might be involved with thinking about rules, right? So the extra we're not adding is what we think good and bad are, our ideas about who we are in that moment in the midst of good and bad and going beyond good and bad. So that extra gets between us and pure mind or direct experience of this moment, whatever's going on in this moment. So because this moment is the true reality of all beings, it includes both the individual elements and the equality of all elements. And somehow in the midst of that, I think it gives us a different perspective on the rules and guidelines that we have in place as human beings to get along and have a harmonious association. So, what would you all like to say about good and bad, going beyond good and bad? It's a huge conversation. And maybe you have some areas where that's working in your life right now. What would you all like to say or share or ask? Everyone's good, no one's bad, huh?
I guess I could give a little linguistic commentary on this one.
Please.
Um,
Yay.
so, you're using the translation from Nishijima, right? The
Yes.
one that said
Yes.
obviate
Yes.
all whatever. Um,
So I looked at that, and I also looked at the Kanji Shobogenzo you sent me.
okay, yeah. So that
Yay.
character that he translated as obviate, I thought that was kind of a weird choice because that character, and hold on, I can put it in the chat. It's actually like a pretty purely pictographic kind of character. Hold on just a sec, let me put it in here.
Is that the one about cutting and letting go?
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of just looks like a smudge, but on the left-hand side, it has repeated 4 times the radical that means thread, and there's a line going through it, and then on the right-hand side is the radical for an axe. So it's, a thread being cut in half, and it means to cut off or to sever, not obviate. Which I think gives a clearer sense of what is meant there, is of rather going beyond or sort of like dropping off body and mind, like that sort of usage, rather than making unnecessary, because I don't think the point is that rules are unnecessary, which is what obviate implies, but rather that they're just sort of altogether surpassed. So that's all I have
Yay.
on that.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's really helpful. And yeah, I didn't go there, but yeah, that's really helpful. Because we've seen, even just in this conversation, we can't we've got to follow the traffic laws or we're going to kill people. So we can't, those things are not unnecessary, but we have to see a different perspective. So thank you for sharing. I can see this is going to become a regular feature. Doju's Language Corner is going to be a regular feature of I'm thrilled, by the way. This is terrific. What would others like to say or ask? Thoughts about good and bad and going beyond good and bad? Hoshin, please.
Yeah, I'm gonna just offer just a thought about this, kind of a comment, I guess. I guess this gate for me talks about the golden rule as much as anything, as an easy way to kind of grasp it. But I think it's, if you think of what the golden rule is, treat others as you would have yourself be treated. So it's kind of an odd use of the self to get to understand this gate. So that kind of struck me as maybe a way to enter this point.
Yeah, well, I think, understanding the commonality can be helpful because, as we say, when the enemy has a human face, it's like, okay, wait a minute, there's some common ground there. How would I want to be treated? And then we get to look at that within the realm of self-clinging, right? I want something, therefore I assume everybody wants the same thing I want, which we know isn't always true. We've said here before, sometimes we have to be careful about, with our best of intentions as bodhisattvas, we see a suffering being, we offer what we would want. Oh, wait a minute. What that person might want in this circumstance might be different. So it is a wonderful gateway into finding that common ground. And, so there's the equality of all elements. And then the individual piece says, this person might want something different or need something different than I do. So yeah, it's a great intersection. That whole golden rule thing is a great intersection to work with with this gate. Yeah. Other things folks would like to say?
Yeah, I think following up on that, another sort of interesting feature of the way that this particular Dharma gate is laid out. So it says, sorry, what is that translation? Equality of all elements, but actually, I think what it says is great equality.
Great equality.
Yeah. And then on the other side, you have, harmony.
Yeah.
So there's this parallelism between, harmony and equality, which are sort of the same thing. So it's sort of saying, kind of like, with the golden rule, like if you treat everyone equally, you don't have to have special rules about equality.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, there are several places in those kanji where there's this feeling of coming together or integration or harmony or kind of bringing together. And we certainly see lots of teachings about that. This broad perspective that says we treat everything equally. Everything that we encounter is ourselves, and we treat it like. And then it's easy to live up here and say, the things that I'm responsible for every day aren't important. And we know in early Western practice, people fell into that pitfall. There was a lot of, well, I don't need to do any work because in the big world, everything's fine and what I do doesn't matter. Like, oh, no, not what our teachers are teaching us. I think we understand that a little better today somehow. Anything else this morning? Sagan, please.
Could you say a little bit more about the use of the term elements there? I mean, is that referring just like to all dharmas, or what is the notion of elements?
Yeah, well, so as Doju has pointed out, there in the kanji there aren't like the four classical elements, which I've talked about here before. So it got translated as the four elements, but equality of elements. But it's not. I think it's not talking about that. I think it is talking about all the individual dharmas, right? All the forms we encounter, all the things we can distinguish. So that elements is not a direct translation, and maybe Doju has something more to say about that. But again, it says like great equality, which is making me think, this is the broadest possible sense of equality, like seeing, because I think there's something about seeing everything, which is equality. There is nothing I'm ignoring. There's nothing I'm choosing not to include. So I think there's a whole lot of non-separation there, right? Equality in that, it seems to me when I read this, it sort of points to there's nothing left out. The Buddha's way is unsurpassable. So my sense is that's where that's going. You had a follow-up?
I was just going to say maybe it's sort of the notion of like an all-encompassing vision, sort of.
Yeah, yeah. So I think it's like seeing with eyes of Buddha, right? So we see and accept it all. So I also think there's something there about accepting. So we know we've talked many times about the acceptance of suffering. Doesn't mean we think it's good. It means we have to accept that it exists. So it's like there's nothing we're leaving out. There's nothing we're choosing not to see. There's nothing we're sort of being ignorant of. We're seeing the totality of this moment. So the decisions, I'm going to use the word decisions, but it's not the right word. The decisions we're making about our action are based on all possible, having all the information as opposed to having only the narrow viewpoint, right? So the equality of all elements, all of that is factoring into what's arising in this moment. So all the elements in this network, which are functioning together, are contributing to the arising of whatever the activity is that the universe in the form of this one is taking. I mean, I'm going like, that's great equality, right? I mean, it's like the biggest possible perspective. The more I think about this gate, it's like, oh, there's something else that unfolds there for me. I just think it's a really kind of interesting thing to sit with.
In a sense, it kind of sounds like an absence of blockages in a way.
Yeah, exactly. It feels a lot like that. So it feels a lot like your image that you bring up sometimes about when things freeze, we're stuck in the ice. It feels like there's no stuck in the ice, right? There's total dynamic functioning, and there's nothing getting in the way of that. And in that sense, there is equality. It's not an equality about I like this or don't like this, or I see this or I don't see that. It's like everything is doing what it does and nothing's getting in the way, including my little perspective. This whole thing about equality and good and bad, it's like there's a sort of a really coarse level of that, which is, I like this, I don't like that, and I'm perpetuating suffering based on that. And then the more you like peel that onion, it just becomes more and more interesting. There's just like more and more stuff you can sort of let go of. It's like, oh, there's a broader and broader and broader perspective. And the more you just like sit with that, it just becomes really interesting. Sorry, I get excited about it because I think there's a lot to explore in that gate. That intersection, just there's a lot there.
That reminds me a lot of that poem of Uchiyama's about the water being, the water before being scooped up into a ladle, and then the water after it's been, thrown out again. So that, in a sense, the water is that kind of lack of blockages in a way.
Right. If everything flows, which feels kind of Taoist, doesn't it? Other things folks would like to say?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, the word elements is not actually there. That's sort of a creative translation. But I put it in the chat. The first two characters together as a compound just mean great. The first character means many on its own, and I think maybe that is what Nishijima was like getting elements from. But as a compound, it just means great.
Yeah.
And then the last two mean equality, but it literally means flatness, which is kind of cool.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Ah, that's interesting. Good. Okay. Sagan, are you waving? Okay. Other comments this morning?
Sawyer sort of bowing in here. Hello.
Hi.
I'm finding my mind drawn to what you were saying, Hoko, what you're pointing to as a sort of psychological growth or maturation of our ideas about ethics, the toddler view and the teenager view, or and the more adult view. And it reminds me of, I guess, something I encountered, I think, in opening the hand of thought about, I think Uchiyama sometimes translates bodhisattva as mature adult.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering, I guess, and I guess this can be a pitfall too, but how, as practitioners, our ideas about good and bad can mature, whether we start to see wholesomeness rather than good for me or bad for me, or how that might unfold in an individual practitioner's mind or life.
Yeah, I think it's very much about having a deeper and deeper understanding of self, right? And the limitations of, or about the nature of small self and the nature of, universal self, right? One of the things I think we notice as the toddler gets older is that the view becomes broader, and it's much less about what's in it for me at the grossest possible level in this moment, and becomes a little bit more about what's maybe better for others. Somebody else will be unhappy, or somebody else will be hurt, or society says this isn't good, or something, right? So the view gets broader beyond I want my cookie and I want it right now, right? So I think as practitioners, we become a little bit better able over time to let go of the clinging to self and everything that goes with that. I've also, some time ago, I read something, I can't remember what it was, that said as we become older and older adults, so we start to move into like retirement age, we become a little bit more altruistic because we're not concerned so much with the career path and, what my kids need in this moment. So, in older folks, we might see more giving, we might see more volunteering, we might see a broader view. So I'm guessing as we become more and more mature, it's a little bit easier to let go of the sort of self-clinging that we might have as toddlers or as beginning practitioners. And I think it's interesting that he translates bodhisattva as mature adult. It's like we get to see more broadly, we can see where we're getting stuck, where we're clinging to self, and where we're clinging to delusion. So I think there probably is a progression there. There is a maturity there. When we see teachers who've been teaching an awfully long time, or people who've been practicing for an awfully long time, I think one of the things we notice is there is much less self-clinging. And I think that's part of that process. Does somebody else want to comment on that? Sagan, please.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. It's probably obvious, but the term wholesome, I mean, when we get to the notion of wholesome, really, it ties in very closely with the notion of being whole, having a whole view, having a very complete view of let's say the network of interdependence. And so what is wholesome is what sort of takes into consideration the whole network, in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I've said before, I think so much of our practice is about integration or reintegration, right? It's not that things aren't already connected. It's not that there's not already wholeness. It's that we don't see it, and we want to create, separation. There are parts of ourselves we don't like that we get to reintegrate. There are elements of this interdependent origination network that we, want to integrate. So that whole, no pun intended, that whole idea about wholesomeness, I think is central. I think it's key. Yeah.
And one other thing about that, sorry, another linguistic note. So I'm putting in the chat, so this set of two characters,
Yeah.
so Japanese is weird because you can read things in different ways. Like there's usually a Chinese reading and a Japanese reading for any given character. So when read as in the Japanese way, this would be pronounced otona, and it means adult. And when it's read in the Chinese way, it's daijin, and it means mahasattva, the great being. So that's the pun that he was playing with there. Because the character, the first one can mean great or big, and the second one means person. So if you interpret it as big person, it's like adult, but great person is like mahasattva. So
I love it. Isn't that great? So when we think about big mind, magnanimous mind, right? There's again, it's this broad view of wholeness. But yeah, I love that, an adult as a great being. Yeah, so there we go. That's interesting. Thank you for that. It's good to have another linguist in the room. And I don't mean me. I don't mean I'm the first one. Other things people would like to say today? Okay, let's do our closing chant, and then I think Hoshin probably has some announcements for us. Thanks for a very good discussion this morning, folks. Stay safe out there this week, and we will see you next time.